it's an honour to be here today to have the opportunity to share some of the research findings from the work that we've been doing, and then also to put my clinical hat on at the end and talk a little bit about how we might maintain well-being and how we might promote well-being across the lifespan. So, as Phil said, I am a clinical psychologist based at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, and I also work as part of a large research network called the Cerebra Network, which is a collaborative network across 4 universities. And just to say to start with, there are a lot of people behind the scenes that are contributing to this research that are not just me, and I'm hugely grateful for that wide research team, also my colleagues at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital and BBS UK, for all the support that they've given to this research over the years that we've been doing it. Now, when we came to the conference several years ago now, so this was back in 2017, and what we wanted to do at that point was really get a sense of what some of the psychological needs were from the group by speaking with adults and parents and just finding out about their concerns and the areas that they wanted us to research. Because our work predominantly focuses on things such as cognition, emotion, behaviour, so people's thinking styles, how they behave in the world, and the emotions that they might experience. And what we've shown over a number of years that sometimes someone's genetic syndrome might lead to them to have more likelihood of showing certain traits or have certain needs that are associated with that rare genetic syndrome. So we really want to understand that in BBS, but the first point is coming to you and saying, actually, what is important to you, what matters? And the things that came out at that point were the adults spoke about, a real need to focus on emotional well-being, so things such as anxiety, low mood, that some individuals, but not all, as we'll go on to see, experience. Difficulties, sometimes people had down-regulating emotions, so sometimes emotions can feel really big and really out of control, and just that need to help kind of calm those emotions and settle those emotions at those points. Some individuals, some adults spoke about difficulties sometimes holding attention on certain things that they might be doing and how their minds might flip between certain topics of conversation or certain focuses across the day, and how that can be quite difficult then to attend to what other people are saying, or you might jump around in a conversation. Somebody described this as it being a bit like a butterfly mind, so your mind's kind of settling for a moment and then moving on to something else. Some individuals spoke about social interaction and wanting to have a better understanding about their social interaction, how to engage with other people. And some parents raised that they were concerned about some aspects of social interaction and how to promote that in their children. And finally, there were comments about how people with BBS sometimes really like routines, like things to be quite structured, quite the same way, and when things change, that can be difficult for individuals. So taking this all together, we were looking at this profile of the things that we'd been told, and we've seen similar profiles to this before in some other groups that we've worked with, and it gave us some clues about some of the things we might want to look at in terms of psychological needs, first in BBS, to see whether we could explain some of the anxiety and low mood that people are experiencing a little bit later down the line. Now, it must be said that people with BBS are encountering a huge range of day-to-day life difficulties in terms of managing health conditions and just generally navigating within the world, meeting people, and all of the things that can come up when you have sight impairment and sight loss that can lead to individuals potentially experiencing mental health difficulties. But what we're also interested in is whether there's anything beyond those difficulties that might then account for some of the poorer outcomes that we see in some people with BBS. That being said, so from the research that we've been conducting, we've spoken to around 20 parents and carers of people with BBS who have children, so under the age of 16, and around 30 adults with BBS. And we've been asking them about mental health, anxiety, depression, screening for these sorts of outcomes. And what we see predominantly is that most people, so approximately 7 out of 10 people in our study, did not meet clinical cutoff for anxiety and depression. So, you know, this is quite a large proportion of people that were doing really well with BBS, that were living meaningful, fulfilled lives, that were not struggling with these mental health outcomes at the end. And I think it's just important to say that, because it can become very negative when we're focusing on anxiety and low mood. But we're actually talking about approximately 3 out of 10 in our research study who are having some difficulties with anxiety and depression in adulthood. However, these rates are still higher than what we would like to see. They're higher than the general population, so it's still important that we understand why that's the case, and look into that in more detail. But it is largely a good trajectory for many people in terms of mental well-being by the time people reach adulthood. So I'm focusing quite a bit on adults today, and I will touch on childhood as well. But the reason for focusing on adulthood is that often adults are underrepresented in the research literature, at least in terms of mental health. So I think it's really important to have that opportunity to talk about mental health for adults specifically. But I will nod towards the research that we've done with children as we go along and pick that up again at the end of the presentation. Now, the things then that we were interested in that might be associated with anxiety and low mood, and that's it's really clinically significant anxiety and low mood, were things such as age, things such as somebody's vision, that seems very important for BBS, gender, and the number of other health conditions that that individual is currently encountering and the severity of those health difficulties. But we were also interested in looking at these 3 things on the slide, which I'll read out now for you, which was the social communication style, executive functioning, and capacity for uncertainty. And I'll go through each one of those one at a time, just so you can understand what those were. And these 3 things are things that we were interested in because they often cluster together. So when people have social interaction difficulties, they sometimes have difficulties with executive functioning and sometimes have difficulty with capacity for uncertainty. And these are often associated with maybe having more autistic-like characteristics. And we also know that autistic-like characteristics are associated with BBS, so some individuals will have these characteristics. So we were interested in whether this cluster of characteristics together might explain some of the poorer outcomes in mental health for some individuals, given that we know in autistic individuals, these 3 things tend to predict poor mental health for people who have those characteristics. So we've just had a look at these. So in terms of social communication style, what we were interested in is social communication differences. So this is differences in how people might process social information, understand social situations, and also might be related to some other autistic characteristics in terms of how much people might like things to be the same or keep things routine and the same. The executive function skills that we were looking at, executive function is sounds like quite a technical term, but essentially these were things such as the person's ability to be able to plan, organise, problem solve. So they're a mental set of skills, they're a cognitive or mental set of skills that we use to be every day to be able to organise our lives. So it's things such as being able to hold things in our short-term memory so that we can use that information for the task at hand, whatever we're doing. It's being able to put the brakes on our behaviour, so not respond impulsively in a situation, blurt out the answer to something, or suddenly react quite quickly without thinking through the consequence of that particular action. It's also the ability to be able to move smoothly from doing things one way and changing to doing things another way, so not sort of getting stuck on doing things the same way over and over again. So we need good executive function skills to be able to problem solve and to be able to function well within the world. And capacity for uncertainty is the person's individual capacity for how much they can tolerate uncertainty. So there's a huge amount of uncertainty in the world, and people with BBS are encountering more uncertainty than most people. But then beyond that, each of us have our own capacity for uncertainty. So what might be one person's capacity might be different from another person's capacity. And we know that intolerance for uncertainty or poor capacity for uncertainty or maybe just not quite as strong as other capacity for uncertainty might be associated with anxiety as well. And when these three things come together, we might be more likely then to see anxiety and low mood. And this is what we wanted to investigate. So many of you helped with this, so thank you so much for everybody that completed the study. So for the children and adults together, as I say, we've got around 50 individuals, but we're going to be just talking mainly about the adult data at the moment. So we first had this questionnaire study, and we had adults complete the questionnaires so that we could look at the associations between these different things we were interested in measuring. And then we also had just shy of 20 people, slightly fewer than we'd hoped to get, so we were impacted by the pandemic quite a lot, but when we picked up data collecting after the pandemic, but just shy of 20 people, had 19 people take part in a direct assessment study where we did assessments that looked at executive function, that looked at capacity for uncertainty. And some of you may have taken part in that study, and thank you very much for your help with that. So from the questionnaires, when we looked at these, what we found, surprisingly, was that age, gender, and sight impairment was not associated with anxiety and low mood in adulthood in our study. Now, that doesn't mean that we will replicate this. This is the study that we've conducted, but we didn't find that these things were associated. But what we did find was that the severity or perceived severity of current health conditions, which is very understandable, was associated. Social communication style, executive functioning, and the capacity for uncertainty were also strongly associated with more anxiety and more low mood in adults. So these three things that we hypothesized were associated and were quite strongly associated. Now, just to be careful here, this is just correlational research, so any of you that are scientifically minded might be thinking, well, that doesn't prove that one leads to the other, or that we can say that these things are risk factors for the development of mental health difficulties. But it's the first step, because it gives us some clues about some of the potential risk factors that might lead to mental health difficulties, and also gives us some clues from a psychological point of view about what we might be able to focus on in terms of improving mental health outcomes for people in the long term. But we need to do more research to fully understand these associations. The last one of these, so the capacity for uncertainty, as I said, is quite difficult to measure because people are experiencing very uncertain lives. So if you take person A and you compare them with person B, it might be that person B has got a lot more uncertainty in their life than person A. So when you ask them questions about their capacity for uncertainty, what you're not sure of is whether you're actually picking up whether their life is just very, they're having to deal with a lot of uncertainty, and therefore that's what you're picking up, rather than that individual's capacity for managing the uncertainty. So in the direct assessment study, we were able to look at this in a bit more detail to try to tease these things apart. And what we did is we asked adults to sit and contemplate various different scenarios, and we asked adults to focus on those scenarios and tell us how anxious they might feel in each of those scenarios. So the direct assessment study specifically was looking at anxiety, rather than anxiety and low mood. And to give you an example of this, one of the scenarios provided information that was negative but certain. So we said, I want you to imagine that someone you know tells you that you didn't do very well today. How anxious would that make you feel on a scale of 1 to 10? And we asked people to rate their anxiety. And then we gave scenarios which were ambiguous, that weren't certain whether they were negative outcomes or positive outcomes. It was just ambiguous information. So, for example, someone asks to speak to you today whilst you're out. So you don't tell the person what the consequence of that interaction is or how that interaction went. And what we found was that adults with BBS were much more likely to rate the scenarios that had the ambiguous information that were uncertain as anxiety-provoking, and that their scores on these ambiguous situations were strongly correlated with their likelihood of having a diagnosis of anxiety. So it seems, again, that we were able to replicate this association with uncertainty in a slightly more controlled way for adults with BBS. Now, in the children, if you've got parents in the room here, and there'll be parents wondering about what this means for children, We haven't been able to look at all of these variables in the children because we have to use questionnaire measures that we know are valid, we know are measuring the right things. But in the children, we did look at executive functioning and the association with low mood. And we also looked at, in the children, health severity and autism characteristics and the association with low mood. And we found similar patterns where executive functioning was associated with low mood, where we found that health severity, the degree of health, the severity of the health conditions was associated with low mood. But we didn't find that association with those social interaction skills or the autism characteristics. But overall, what we're starting to see is sort of a pattern of factors or characteristics in BBS that might be therefore associated with anxiety and low mood. But we need to do more work to understand that. And we need to follow people up over time to see how they might be thinking and feeling about situations when they're young predicts how they are then functioning in adulthood. So that would be our next step, to really follow people up to see whether we can show one thing leads to another, because at the moment these are just correlated, they just are associated. But what does it actually mean in terms of practical strategies? Thank you. So I've thrown a lot of different terminology and words at you, and we're beginning to build these models of potentially factors that lead to anxiety and low mood in BBS. But we know that irrespective of those models, there are some key things that promote well-being, promote mental health, and that these things, based on the profile that we're seeing in BBS, should be a good fit. So the research tells us that these things should be a good fit. The first thing is, which we talk about, and you've probably heard about quite a bit, and I think has also probably been picked up yesterday in the 5 factors to well-being for children in the workshop yesterday evening, is that focus on being in the present moment, being mindful, trying to train your mind to stay in the here and now. And we talk a lot about mindfulness, but in BBS this is particularly important. So trying to practice being mindful every day. There are apps that you can use and download that take you through guided meditations and mindfulness to try and develop that skill, because bringing your attention back into the moment and practicing that skill over and over again helps to us manage emotions, and it helps us stay very present and address some of the underlying factors that we might know are associated with mental health difficulties. In terms of emotional regulation, if you're a parent of a young child but also an adult, there are things you can do to practice emotional regulation skills when you're not overwhelmed with the big emotion. So it can be very, very difficult to try and regulate an emotion when it happens if you've not practiced how to do that prior to experiencing that emotion. So things such as learning to do, counting to 10 in the deep breathing, or doing, for young children, getting a squeezy ball, and when children are feeling stressed, teaching them, modelling to squeeze that, let that go, release, let that go. Trying to build in a strategy, but practicing at times when the individual isn't stressed, when the individual isn't under pressure, can really help then you to prompt that at times when those emotional regulation difficulties are more of a difficulty for that young person. Due to the potential executive function difficulties in the syndrome, it can be very, very difficult for people to problem solve, and it can be difficult to work through complex problems. So breaking that down into a number of chunks and having somebody you can talk to help you break that down into a number of chunks. If you're an adult with BBS, you need some support with that. Try and break any task or any thing that you're trying to do, and work through what are the steps, what are the stages, rather than trying to view it as a whole, which can be overwhelming. The 4th point on my slide is avoid avoidance. And I think perhaps for me this is perhaps one of the most important factors to think about around anxiety. When people don't like uncertain situations, the natural thing to do is to avoid them. It's to try and stay away from the uncertainty. It's very self-protecting. You avoid it, you don't have to experience the discomfort. But over time, what can happen when we do that is our world starts to shrink. So the more we avoid the things that make us anxious, the more the world shrinks and the more the anxiety grows. Now, what I'm not suggesting is if you're currently avoiding lots of uncertainty that you suddenly go and jump into the situation that's most uncertain and absolutely throw yourself into the deep end or take your child into that situation, because it would probably be very counterproductive. But if you notice, and this is where the mindfulness comes in, if you notice that you are avoiding small things that are relatively uncertain, but they're just a little bit uncomfortable. You don't really want to do them. They're just a little bit uncomfortable. But you notice you're avoiding them. Try to stop yourself and push yourself to go and to do the thing, even though it feels a little bit uncomfortable. And that way, you're just gradually pushing back against that avoidance of uncertainty and just almost expanding the world back out, like blowing air into a balloon. You know, you have to keep putting a little bit of air into the balloon so that it doesn't deflate. And that's like our world. We don't want it to shrink, so we just have to push that little bit of air in and just try to just keep approaching those situations gradually. But just watch out for avoidance, because it can be the thing that catches us all out. And particularly parents who want to protect their children. You want to not have your children experience distress. Sometimes it can be easy to avoid to avoid with your child, but try to avoid avoidance. Hopefully that makes sense. And lastly, is self-compassion. So when you're trying to do these things, you will fail many, many times. And it's very easy to then berate ourselves, to be unkind to ourselves, to say, I should have gone out today, I should have done this, I should have done that. I should have practiced my mindfulness, and I didn't. We're all the same. We're none of us are perfect, and we need to be on our own, our own best friend, the voice that we listen to when on those days when things are hard needs to be that supportive voice. So it's helpful to imagine perhaps what if you had the best friend in the world and what they would say to you when you do fail, when things don't go right, and try to just almost imagine they're on your shoulder, following you around, giving you all of those positive messages that you need, because self-compassion is really important. It sounds very fluffy, but it's really, really important when we're practicing these things to keep us going and to know that we will have days when it's harder than other days, but keep going anyway and be on your own side with it. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.